Hey everyone, Adam here with another RimWorld guide, this time about clothing. I get viewers on my stream asking all the time how I deal with the micromanagement involved in making clothing, having people wear the right stuff, dealing with tattered clothing, and so on. So I decided to make this guide in order to show you how to completely automate your clothing production, so you'll never have to worry about it again. So in this guide, I'm going to go over automating both the production of apparel and setting up rules so your colonists automatically wear the right stuff and never get that dreaded tattered apparel mood debuff. Alright, so let's start out with making the clothing itself. In the coming examples, I'm going to be using a tailor bench and complex clothing from the research tree, but this method does work with any apparel, from tribal wear at a crafting spot to marine helmets at a fabrication bench and everything in between. So first off, we're going to click on the production building and then click Bills in the bottom left. Under the Add Bill button, I'm going to click on Make Pants. Now, if we leave it as is, your tailor will make a single pair of pants and then suspend the order. We don't want that. We want to be able to set it and forget it for the rest of the game, no matter how many colonists we end up getting or losing. So we're going to click on the Details button and then click Do X times. We're now going to choose Do until you have X instead. We're going to want to set this number to a 1. Later in the game, you may want to have a larger stockpile for certain situations though. If that's ever the case, you can set this higher, but I generally just leave it at either 1 or 2 for the entire playthrough, including colonies of 40 plus pawns. We also want to be sure to not click on either Count Equipped or Count Tainted. We also want to leave the default Look Everywhere. Now comes a super important part, and one you may want to function differently in some of your playthroughs. We want to set the minimum HP to either greater than 51% or greater than 61%. Why these numbers? And RimWorld Clothing will eventually become ratty or tattered. This will give the pawn wearing it a mood debuff. In addition, the clothing will lose much of its value. If you only care about ensuring your colonists never get the tattered apparel debuff, then you want to set this in the low 50s. However, if you want to trade or gift old clothing for a nice sum, you want to set this in the low 60s. This is because apparel loses 50% of its value once it drops below 60%. It loses 90% of its value if it drops below 50%, however. For this example, I'm going to set this at 55%. I also generally recommend setting the minimum quality to normal. Later, you can increase this even further if you'd like. The higher quality the apparel, the higher defensive stats, temperature properties, and value it's going to have. For this example, I'm going to go with normal. All right, let's hop over to the ingredient list on the right for a moment before we continue down this other side. By default, the game will use any textile you have to make the clothing. There may be some situations where you only want a certain material used, such as devil strand in the late game. If this is the case, simply uncheck everything else. At the very least, I do recommend unchecking human leather so that you do not have to micromanage human leather clothing, unless of course you're running a war crime cult like I do, in which case, have at it. I'm not going to take a ton of time to go over what material is best in this guide, but a general rule of thumb is that thrumbo fur and hyperweave are the best. Devil strand is a close third. Leather's pretty decent, and cloth is at the bottom. Now, back over to the left side. If you've decided to limit the materials you want used to make clothing worn by your colonist, be sure to click the Only Allowed Ingredients button. Otherwise, just leave it as is. For this example, we're going to leave it set to the default. We're also going to leave Pause When Satisfied set to the default, as it's mostly only useful with larger number work orders. If you leave the Take to Best Stockpile selected, then your tailor will place the finished item somewhere it will count when they are finished. If you select Drop on the Floor and the worker drops the item in a spot where there is no stockpile zone or shelf, the item's not going to immediately count, and they could turn around and start working on another item, even though you don't have it set to make more than one. As such, I would generally leave this to Take to Best Stockpile if you are maintaining just a small number of these items, like the 1 to 2 that I suggested. Next, you can either choose for a specific pawn to make the item, such as having your production specialists from the Ideology DLC make them, or choose a minimum skill any worker must have to make the item. I won't go over all the breakpoints, but the tipping point in which the worker is more likely to make normal quality or better and not waste as much value, so to say, is 6. And of course, you won't always have a level 6 crafter in every situation, but I thought I'd throw it out there. The more you know. Before we move on to the apparel rules, I wanted to give 2 overlapping points of advice. First, I highly recommend putting a zone, or better yet, a shelf, right next to your production bench, then changing the storage button to contain only the ingredients you will use to craft at this spot, and setting the priority to critical. This will save a lot of travel time. You could also have a nearby shelf for the finished items if you'd like. Second, I highly recommend limiting the ingredient radius. If you're like me and have dozens or hundreds of different work orders in the late game, limiting their radius to a lower number can actually help late game performance substantially. Alright, now your clothing work orders are all set up. With a loadout, you can see on my screen, my colonists will keep one pair of pants, one button-down shirt, and one duster, all decent quality and none of them tattered or tainted, as long as I have the material to do so. When I get a new colonist, they will be able to put these items on, which will trigger a tailor to come and make a new set. Likewise, if a colonist takes off a tattered item to equip a better one, it'll fire again to maintain that stock number that we set. Unfortunately though, even with all the apparel work orders set up correctly, colonists will keep right on wearing terrible, tattered clothing if you don't set up an apparel policy. To do that, we're going to click on Assign at the bottom of the screen, and then click Manage Apparel Policies. You can edit the existing policies or make your own. For the sake of shortening this video, we'll do a very simple edit of the Anything policy. This is a good one to edit as it will be what new colonists are set to when they join you anyway. After clicking on Anything, we're going to change the HP to be a number less than our work order, but above the tattered threshold or above that 60% range if you're doing the setup for value. Since I set my work order to 55%, I'm going to go ahead and set this a little lower. Let's just go with 54%. I'm also going to go ahead and choose normal as the minimum quality for my colonist. Next, I will uncheck tainted so they do not put on tainted apparel and get the default mood debuff. After this, you can set whatever you'd like. I'll typically turn off utility and micromanage that myself, or at least make a rule for melee characters to only use shield belts and ranged characters to not equip shield belts. Since we edited the anything rule, all of my colonists are already set for this rule. However, if you made a new rule, you'd apply it by clicking on the apparel policy button next to each colonist. These buttons are copy and paste draggable. Another quick note is that when you first do this, some pawns might strip down to nothing, as you probably don't have enough initial clothing for everyone to put on the new stuff. If this is a concern, you can always make an initial overstock before assigning the apparel policies. Again, depending on your pawn count. And now it's all set. Colonists will always change into better clothing before it hits the point of being tattered, and crafters will get to work replenishing that stock. It sounds like a lot of work and maybe a little complex, but after a few times, you're going to be setting this up within seconds. It's going to save you a ton of time and trouble in the long run. If you enjoyed this RimWorld clothing guide or it helped you at all, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, leaving a comment down below, and sharing it with others. If you'd like to reference a written version of this guide, be sure to head over to my website, adamversuseverything.com/guides. Also, if you want to see some full-length RimWorld playthroughs, make sure you click on the live tab on my YouTube page. And as always, thank you for watching.